An English naturalist and geologist, Charles Darwin, published a book entitled The Origin of the Species, which is considered the foundation of the scientific theory of evolution by natural selection. He established that all species of life have been descended over time from common ancestors. Literature on Darwin and his heritage usually highlight the role of his observations of wild nature during his voyages to Australia, Cape Town, South America, and islands in the Pacific as a source of his evolutionary theory. Yet, another source for his inspiration to study wild nature is barely mentioned, and that is the early Islamic literature in biology and zoology. In reality, the serious scientific discussions on evolution began at least 1,000 years before Charles Darwin, mainly by Muslim scholars. Abu Usman Amr ibn Bahar, commonly known as Al-Jahiz, was the originator of the idea of evolution through his famous book entitled Kitab Al-Hayawan, the Book of the Animal. Al-Jahiz was an Arab prose writer, the author of works on adab, philosophy, Mu'tazili theology, politico-religious polemics, and scientific essays. He was born in Basra in 776 and learned various disciplines at different Moscow circles. Later, he joined Mu'tazili circles and Borgelis silence in Basra, Baghdad, and Samarra, where conservation were animated by philosophical, theological, and scientific problems. In Kitab Al-Hayawan, Al-Jahiz introduced early evolution ideas by describing food chains and showing how animals struggle against each other to survive. He proposed that the environment forced animals to adapt to change their traits over time, a concept very similar to modern natural selection. However, unlike modern science, Al-Jahiz believed that Allah will directly cause all of these biological mutations. He argued that nature moves in stages where non-living things turn into plants evolve into animals, and humans represent the final, highest stage of this animal evolution. By studying animal psychology and adaptation, he laid down the core concept that Charles Darwin would later use centuries later. Islamic evolutionary ideas reached Europe through book translation starting in the 1600 centuries. Important books like Al-Damir's Hayat Al-Hayawan, which copied Al-Jahiz, was translated into Latin in Paris in 1617. Another book by Ibn Tufayl was printed in Oxford in 1671. These translations entered European universities and became the foundation for modern biology. This idea was so famous in Europe that a scientist named John William Draper called it the Mohammedan theory of evolution in 1878. Charles Darwin learned these Islamic ideas in two ways. First, he learned from his grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, who read books by Muslim philosophers. Second, Darwin himself learned Arabic and studied Islamic culture at the University of Cambridge. He was a student of Samuel Lee, an expert of Eastern books. Darwin's own letter shows that he met with Lee often to discuss these topics. This shows that Darwin could read Arabic and use ideas from Muslim scholars like Al-Jahiz to build his famous theory.
Now I will continue the presentation by explaining the theory of struggle for existence as mentioned by Al-Jahiz. This is the constant competition between living things for limited resources such as food, space, and mates. Since more offsprings are born than the environment can support, not all of them can survive. Now, let's demonstrate Al-Jahiz's idea of the struggle for existence through a simple activity. Here we have two butterflies. One is camouflaged butterfly while the other one is non-camouflaged butterfly. And we also have a bird as the predator. Then we put these two butterflies in the same spot. Now imagine a bird flying by in search of food. Which butterfly do you think the bird will notice first? As we can see, the non-camouflaged butterfly stands out much more against the tree trunk, making it easier for bird to spot because it is more visible and more likely to be eaten by the predator. In contrast, the camouflaged butterfly blends into the tree trunk, making it much harder for the bird to detect. As a result, it has a greater chance of surviving. If this process continues over many generations, butterflies with better camouflage are more likely to survive and reproduce. This simple activity demonstrates the struggle for existence described by Al-Jahiz in Kitab Al-Hayawan.
Next,
Long before Charles Darwin wrote his famous book, The Origin of Species, in 1859, a 19th century scholar named Al-Jahiz was already deeply studying how living things change over time. Working in Baghdad during a time of the Great Learning, he wrote a massive 7-volume book called Al-Kitab Hayawan, which means the Book of Animals. In this masterpiece, Al-Jahiz became the earliest thinkers in human history to describe the close relationship between organisms and their environment. He did not just list different animals. Instead, he carefully watched how they lived, how they fit into complex food chains, and how they had to constantly fight against each other to survive. He called this natural battle as the struggle for existence. Al-Jahiz explained that harsh weather, a lack of food, and the need for shelter act like heavy pressures that force animals to change their physical traits and adapt over many generations. These incredibly advanced observations laid the important groundwork for later biological thinking across the world. Centuries later, Charles Darwin took these same core ideas of environmental pressure, adaptation, and the struggle for resources and developed them into the formal scientific theory of evolution by natural selection that we study today. This shows us that the great scientific discoveries do not just appear out of nowhere, but are passed down like a torch through history. Ultimately, Al-Jahiz reminds us that careful observation is the foundation of science. His work, together with Darwin's later discoveries, shows how scientific knowledge develops over time, with each generation building on the ideas of those who came before. That's all for me. Thank you.